I will keep my introductions to the speakers short. Shirley is also from Nanyang, she's an associate professor there and associate chair. She's from the School of Communications and Information. She's well known for her work in science communication. So it's a pleasure having you here, Shirley. And Shirley gave an outstanding presentation actually at the Porto Conference on agriculture and food, and it created a lot of positive discussions, and not only among scientists, because there they were FDA people and USDA people, and they were very excited and learning about our project and the SASPO project, and including the social aspects and all these things. So I think that's very encouraging news. But Shirley, the floor is yours. And I look forward to you.
Go left. Yeah. Oh, this one. Okay. Okay. So good morning, everyone, and thanks, Phil, for inviting us here, as well as your introductions. As Phil has mentioned, I'm not a bench scientist. I am a social scientist and who resides in the School of Communications in NTU. So what I actually do in my research is I look at science communication. In other words, how do we communicate, how to understand scientific terms to the lay public, because it's not so easy for the audience, you know, and the lay public to understand what you guys are doing every day. And at the same time, I think what's very important is really the things that you do in your lab. Okay, you spend long hours of your daily lives in your lab. And you want to make sure that whatever you produce, you patent, you know, you commercialize, you want acceptance from the consumers. Take, for example, NANOFOOD, okay, or you would call it scientifically Nano-Enabled Food. If whatever research you pumped into Nano-Enabled Food is not widely accepted by the general public, then what really happens is that you will face rejection from them, and consumers may not want to buy your product. So again, you know, controversial food technologies is not new. I think nano-enabled food is really one type of food that might become controversial. Already it's controversial among small pockets of people around the world. But I think if you look across the different food types, cultured meat that is lab-grown is very controversial. Genetically modified food, of course, has been controversial for decades already. You can see that in parts of Europe, people have already resisting it. And in parts of Asia, there are people who are demanding for labeling of GM food as well. Meat from cloned animals, also very controversial. Okay, let's take a look at cultured lab meat. You can see that in parts of US and the UK, there are a lot of people who are not very receptive to this kind of food type. So in the US, public opinion polls have already shown that only 300, you know, out of maybe less than 30% of the general public are actually receptive to these kinds of novel food. And there are also other types of stakeholders who are against these types of food types as well. Of course, you know, you have the Beef Association, you know, these kinds of stakeholders, they are not very supportive of these kinds of food types, and they might raise voices against cultured meat. Again, GM food, you know, in Europe, you can see that people took to the streets to protest against companies for producing GM pesticides. And in Asia as well, when the new president, you know, was running for election, President Moon, he actually said that he will label GM food in his country. But after he got into office, there was no news about it. So people went to the street and protest, hey, where's the labeling? Nano-enabled food. Again, I would say that in general, right now, the public opinion sentiment is rather positive. I think much more positive than GM food. But then again, there are people who are against it, pockets of people. And there's a public protest in France, against nanotechnology. And in Europe, there are pockets of people who are activists, I would say. They're concerned about food that are imported from the US, especially nano-enabled food that are imported from the US into Europe. They want labeling. They also want regulations against this kind of food types. Right? It's the situation is made worse by scientists who, you also write reports to say that nanofood, there are certain risks to the general public, and especially people are concerned about the effect on certain segments of the population. So, for example, children, if they were to consume formulas that have nanoparticles in it, what are the risks to their bodies? Also advocates, Friends of the Earth, for example. These are just some examples of activist groups who are against nano-enabled food types. Right. So I think this is the most recent ones where France, went ahead to ban nanoparticles in sweets and pastries. And you can see that every now and then there are news like this that are being placed in major news outlets. And bear in mind that public opinion is shaped very much by what they see in the media. Because beyond the classroom setting, after their high school education, most people just go on and with their lives, without exposure to science. Unlike most of you who are scientists over here, people actually get most of their science information about science and policy regarding science and news from the news outlets, and even from interpersonal discussions with friends, family members. So whatever it's being portrayed in the media may have an impact, and research have shown that it does have an impact on what the consumers think about science and technology. And especially for a novel food type like nano-enabled food, people have no information about it. So whatever is being framed in the media may shape their attitudes and opinion. So in NTU, we ran some experiments with participants in Singapore, where we looked at, this is social science experiments, okay? So we actually created a mock-up of the different frames in this study. The study is currently in press with my PhD student, Edmund Lee, joining Vish as his postdoc at Harvard in September. So this particular study is forthcoming in Journalism and Mass Communication Quarterly, one of the flagship journals in our field. And in this study, we're interested to look at the difference between benefit frame and risk frame. So if the message is being framed in a way that conveys the risk versus conveying the benefits, what kinds of effect would it have on public acceptance of nanotechnology? And at the same time, we were interested to look at the effects of photographs and text. Do photos speak more than 1,000 words? Would it have a larger impact on public attitudes as compared to just simply words? So in this benefit frames, it's all mocked up over here. We use the masthead of the Straits Times, which is the major English newspaper in Singapore. Majority of the people speak English, read English newspapers. So this is the newspapers with the widest readership. And over here, we put a photo of nanoparticles, talking about the benefits. And at the same time, we took out the photographs from the text-only frame. In the risk frame, we actually took a photo of nanoparticle risk to food, crops, and diets, and we asked people to read these experimental stimulus as well as the textual frame. Okay, so as I said, this is a social science experiment. We actually randomly assign people into one of the 4 experimental conditions. We actually have more experimental conditions in this set of study, but I'm just presenting a small portion of what we actually published. So we invited participants into our lab where we have a Tobii eye tracker. We get people to sit down and look at the stimulus. We try to track their eye movement to make sure that they actually pay attention to the stimulus and not just, shut down mentally. So this is one way in which we introduce checks and balances into our experiments. Okay, so one of the very straightforward and simple to understand results from the study is the main effects of benefits frame versus risk frame on public support or participant support for nanotechnology. So over here, you can see that people who are exposed to the benefit conditions actually indicated that they would be more likely to support nanotechnology as compared to people who are exposed to the message in the risk condition. And at the same time, I think in this pertains to the descriptive stats for the results in the risk condition. For people who are exposed to the risk frame, when they are exposed to the photography condition, you can see that the public support actually is significantly lower and statistically lower than people who are in the texture condition. So what this means is that photographic frames actually influence public attitudes toward nanotechnology more than texture frames when it comes to the articles that highlight the risk. So in other words, photos are very important. It makes a very much higher impact as compared to just text in the news. And more importantly, what this really shows is that media portrayals of nanotechnology, and to some extent, if you want to infer this to nano-enabled food, it also means that, public opinion might be shaped by what is being covered in the news. Okay. So some common reactions to nano-enabled food when people hear about it. This is taken from some of the public opinion polls that were done by museums in the US. People are concerned about what are the long-term and short-term impacts on their health. Okay, if they were to consume nano particles into their body, what's the impact to their health? And would there be any adverse effects? And if so, how would it be minimized or repaired? And can manufacturers be trusted to ensure that their products are safe? This pertains to trust. And what should the government and manufacturers tell the consumers about nanotechnology? Okay, what information should be relevant? Is labeling required in this sense? And how can we ensure that nano-enabled food is accessible to everyone? This is a question of equity, because some people are concerned that, are we going to place a premium on the product? Is it going to be sold more expensive, just like organic food? Would the less well-to-do be able to purchase this kind of food? So these are the common questions that people actually ask. So a lot of my research, a large part of it actually looks at how the public form opinion about science and technology in general. So I don't really just do nanotechnology or nano-enabled food. I look at science and technology across the board. But this lecture, I will focus more on nanotechnology and nano-enabled food. Okay. So I think in the literature, a lot of scholars, and even scientists, policymakers, they think that science literacy, being knowledgeable, is important for the public because, that will influence their attitudes toward nanotechnology and nano-enabled food. In other words, they're telling people that, okay, I give you more information about nano-enabled food. Okay, the more information, the better, because that would actually, make you more favorable towards this kind of food type. However, a large body of research in social science and in particular science communications have already shown that science knowledge is not the key factor that shapes public opinion. What really matters are all these other factors that might shape public opinion. So, for example, people's values, predispositions, and their beliefs, such as their trust in the stakeholders, their religious beliefs, who do they believe in terms of their religion, the deference to scientific authority, whether or not they believe and trust in scientists, benefits perception, risk perceptions, their preference for natural products. Some people don't like the idea that their foods are being altered along the way. The process in which the food is being, brought to their dinner table must be as natural as possible. So if these people have a high preference for natural products, they might think that, hey, what's with nano-enabled food? What am I eating? That might shape their opinion. Media and communications as well plays a part, as I mentioned, in my earlier study, that how the ways in which messages are being framed in the media can have an impact on audience. Okay, so following this, I'm going to show you two of my recent works that are being published in Journal of Nanoparticle Research and also another journal, and these are done with my colleagues and my grad students at NTU. We were interested to understand, what is the level of support for labeling of nano-enabled food, as well as people's support for banning of nano-enabled food in Singapore. I think some studies have been done in Europe and the US, but really there's no studies that are being done in Asia context. And Singapore, being in Asia, could give us some light in terms of how the public thinks about this issue. And I think it's very important to talk about labeling, because labeling, I think it's only required by the US right now, but in other parts of the world, it's still up for discussions. People are still wondering if there's a need to label it. Whether or not to label it, if you label it, it could be a sign that, hey, this food is dangerous. It could make consumers be wary that, oh, this is dangerous food. Maybe I should not touch it, even buy it. On the other hand, if you look at it this way, if you label it, it could also mean that tell the consumers that this is being approved by the FDA, for example, so it's safe to consume. So it's a sign that the regulatory body is taking care of the delivery process, of this type of food types, and that it should be safe for consumption. And it really, conveys the kind of information to the public that if you see the label, you can make an informed decision and make your own judgment as to whether or not you want to purchase the item. Okay? So banning of nano-enabled food is something that is, I think, a much more extreme in this case, because banning it means that no food is being allowed in this domestic market. So if this is really the case, that means, public must be really resistant to this kind of food type already, to the extent that they don't even want it to be sold in the grocery store, right? So let's take a look at it. So we did, my colleague and I did an online survey that was conducted in 2015. That was pretty couple of years back among the general public in Singapore using an online panel. We collected about 1,000, a sample size of 1,000 people who are Singaporeans and permanent residents. Okay, so here's the result. I show you some very straightforward, simple to understand descriptive data over here. So out of a point of 1 to 7, 1 being strongly disagree and 7, which is strongly agree, people, answer whether or not they are supportive for the labeling of nano-enabled food. So the good news over here, and there's some bad news as well, but I think, yes, they do support banning for labeling of nano food. The mean score over here is 5.8, so people are generally supportive of it. But the good news is that they are actually lukewarm, about support for banning of nano food. The mean score is about 3.95, so people are not really, that supportive of banning the food right now. They might want to see some kind of labeling just so to make sure that they know what they're eating. Okay. So what are the factors that impact, or I would say influence or shape public perception in terms of their support for labeling of nano-enabled food? So if you look at it over here, this set of data shows you the multiple regression analysis. We ran multiple regression analysis where we looked at the association between these independent variables over here in the x-axis, and look at how it impacts the dependent variable, which is support for labeling in the y-axis. So the numbers over here shows that if you look at science knowledge, for example, okay, how does it correlate with support for labeling? It shows you that 0.13 indicates that a 1 unit increase in science knowledge is equivalent to a 0.13 unit increase in support for labeling. And this shows you the strength of the relationship between these two variables. Okay, the higher the strength, the larger the number. It actually means that there is a greater correlations between those two variables. So you see over here that science knowledge plays a small role, okay, among all the other types of independent variables over here. And science knowledge, the more knowledgeable people are, the more they demand for food labeling. It's not that the more knowledgeable they are, they actually don't care about labeling. They actually want more information so that it will help them to make informed decisions. Okay, so if you look at the other factors over here, attitudes toward technology, the more favorable someone is toward technology, actually they want more labeling because they want more information as well. In other words, it doesn't mean that people who are positively or people who are negatively are not favorable about technology. These people may not necessarily be the ones that would say, I don't want to have labeling. Okay, so the more positive attitudes they have towards technology, the more they want labeling. And preference for natural products is something that is consistently, across the different table. You will see that people who have high preference for natural products, they would actually like more labeling, okay, because they want to see, again, more information about it. And attention to food safety news on traditional media, I think because people are primed to think about in terms of food safety, so there's some negative connotation to it. When you talk about food safety on traditional media, it's usually risk-oriented, and therefore, that would actually affect people to support more for labeling. And another big item over here is actually risk perceptions. People who have high level of risk perception, of course, they are going to say, I support labeling. Right, how about banning? You can see over here that when it comes to banning, science knowledge plays a small but significant role as well. But the real contributor over here is risk perceptions and benefits perceptions. And those people who really see that there's high amount of risk with nano-enabled food, they are going to say, I want to ban this kind of food types. Okay, so we really want to manage their risk and make sure that people actually don't have an overly large and irrational fear towards nano-enabled food when the risk is in fact low. Okay. So another study that is still, I think, currently in press is in Science, Technology, and Human Values. We looked at 2 outcome variables, which is attitudes toward nano-food applications, as well as people's intention to purchase nano-foods. To what extent are people willing to spend money to purchase this type of food types? Okay, so here's descriptive data. This is pretty positive news with regard to nano-enabled food, as compared to GM food, because you can see over here that at least in the context of Singapore, people have a fairly positive attitude toward nano-food applications. And the mean score for intention to purchase nano-food is about 4.09, which is fairly higher than the neutral position of 3. Okay, so in this study, we applied the protection motivation theory to look at how threat appraisal and coping appraisal would impact people's level of protection motivation, and which indirectly, impact their intention to engage in purchasing behavior. So very briefly, threat appraisal refers to what extent, to the extent to which people think that consuming nano-enabled food would cause harm to their own body. Okay, and for coping appraisal, it refers to the amount of control people have towards this kinds of risk, if they perceive it as a risk, and to what extent they can overcome these kinds of risk. So people with high A high coping appraisal would think that, it's not that risky, I should be able to mitigate it to some extent. And they might indicate, greater intention to purchase this kind of food type. And the converse is true for threat appraisal. So let's take a look at the results over here. Public attitudes toward nanofood applications. You can see over here that it's the same multiple regression analysis that we ran, and the strength of the correlation for threat appraisal is negatively related to attitudes. In other words, the higher the threat appraisal, you would think that you have less favorable attitudes toward nanofoods. And coping appraisal as well, the more you think that you can cope with it, the more likely it is that you will have a favorable attitude. Okay, then when it comes to intention to purchase nanofood, I think this is the most important part. You can see that threat appraisal, again, and coping appraisal, they are significantly related to intention to purchase nano-enabled food, but in opposite directions. And again, you can see that science knowledge really has a minimal role on intention to purchase. Likewise, preference for natural products actually have a small influence, but the influence is significant. Okay, so what does it all mean for the nanofood industry? How do you communicate nano-enabled food to the public? So based on these studies, there are some recommended strategies, of course, but I think more broadly, what needs to be understood over here is that people don't use their science knowledge to make judgment about novel food types like nano-enabled food. What's more important here is their values, their beliefs, and their emotions. And therefore, simply providing more information to the public is not sufficient. You have to do more than just providing information to the public. So, for example, in terms of media representations, if you were to work with your communication practitioners someday to try to commercialize your product and to market your product to the public, you need to really carry out audience segmentation to disseminate varying types of information to various types of public. So, for example, consumers with high preference natural food, this group of people might be the ones who are less receptive to nano-enabled food. You might want to target these people strategically in order to get buy-in. And use messages of different frames to promote nano-enabled food. So it's not just about risk and benefits frame as well. There are many different framing types that we can use to effect changes in public receptivity. So these are some that we want to think along as we move on. There are other things like, for example, producing nano-specific messages to appeal to people with strong technocratic belief. People with these kinds of belief, actually, they're more receptive to this type of food as well. So perhaps the younger populations who are more, have a stronger technocratic belief might be more receptive to nano-enabled food. And we want to think about how we could market products to them. Collaborate with key players to allay the fear among the public. You can see that risk perception and threat appraisal actually negatively impact public support for nano-enabled food and also their intention to purchase this kind of food type. So allaying their fears and minimizing the perceived risk is very important. Feature the work of acclaimed scientists in the field to boost people's confidence. I know that you would think that it's easier said than done. Scientists don't communicate because they work in their lab, and really they don't have the means and tools to communicate with the public. But I must say that because the general public believes in scientists and have a high level of trust in scientists, the more scientists go out and communicate about their research to the public. So if you find that you don't have the tools to do so, get the tools. Go for communication classes, that are available. Work with the corporate communications officers in your university, for example. They could give you some guidance as to how you could put your research into layman's term and to the public. Okay, so just to wrap up a little bit, I just want to talk a little bit about our NTU Harvard Public Perception Study. That has been running for about 1 year already, and which Vish is also involved. So in this study, this component of the study, we are trying to look cross-cultural comparison of public perceptions between the U.S. and Singapore, and see, if the cultural differences between Singapore and U.S., what are the cultural differences, and actually what are public receptivity towards nano-enabled food between these two countries. So we are going to gather survey data, public opinion data in the U.S. and Singapore for this study. And as I mentioned, this study is led by Vish and myself. Okay, in this study, we are going to look still knowledge, perception, acceptance, and behavioral intention. So these are some of the factors. But we have done how would I say, a better and a closer concept explication of what these concept means in our survey. And in this survey, we are trying to do a much more ambitious task of trying to differentiate between individual level variables, communication variables, interpersonal variables, as well as structural level variables. So let me just give you some idea over here. For individual level variables, we are trying to look at, again, some of these attitudes variables, but I think attitudes toward GM, we just added in, so this is something new. We want to see if people perception towards GM food, whether or not that might impact, that might spill over to their perception towards nano-enabled food, because that might have an effect. Communication variables, we try to differentiate different types of media in much finer details over here, so that we can get at what specific modes of media, the specific modes of media that might have an impact on public perception, and not just broadly mass media or new media. Interpersonal variables, we'll be looking at more insights, like, for example, interpersonal discussions with similar people or dissimilar people. If you keep talking to the same kind of people like you, perhaps you're open to new technology, then that's great. But if you're close to, you have a low level of knowledge, or you think that you're not open to new technology in food types, then if you keep talking to the same kind of people like you might not be open to new food types after all. Okay, so we are looking at social norms to consume nano-enabled food as well. If it becomes a norm that it becomes a food fad, nano-enabled food becomes a food fad. It's very cool to eat this kind of food because it has a lot of nutrients, to your body, and people start to think positively about it. Then you might also think that, hey, other people are already eating it, so maybe I should be fine. It should be fine for me to eat it. But, if majority of people thinks that, oh, this food type to your body, then you would think that, okay, other people already stopped eating it. Maybe I should stop too. So social norms might play a big part in shaping public opinion. Okay, because we are collecting data from two countries, US and Singapore, so we are trying to, with the idea of introducing structural variables as well into our study. So, some structural variables, like, for example, GDP of those two countries, the health index, PISA score, which is a reflection of scientific knowledge, press freedom index as well. The press system in the US and Singapore is very different, okay? Literature has shown that the media system in Singapore is much more regulated than the US. So that might have an impact on how it shapes, media messages shape public opinion. Okay, so these are I've come to the end of my presentation. And over here, you can see that data collection is currently underway. We have already engaged two survey companies, one in Singapore and one in the US, to collect data for us. So hopefully the data could be collected in August this year, and by November we could show you some new data if we come back to Harvard again. Okay, so like Joachim, I would like to just flesh out my team here. They are fun and dynamic. We don't work in labs, but we have offices. But this is just one of the gatherings we have at home, at my place. Okay, so thank you very much for your attention.